want to talk a bit about the Lucy Connolly case. So, this is a subject that I've reflected on a bit, and I've kind of altered my stance a few times because, and that sounds a bit fickle, but I've altered it because of the different way that this is developed, or the way it's developed, I should say. Um, Initially, I went from having no sympathy to this with Lucy Connolly to having some sympathy with her, and once again, I have no sympathy with her. I'm going to read out a piece from the Daily Express, which is very much taking her side. I'm going to read it out because it's useful to counter some of the false right wing narratives that are being spun at the moment about this. I actually bought this edition because they had a piece on the kidnapped Ukrainian children. Um, the Daily Express it's a right wing tabloid, so it's not necessarily what I would be ideologically attached to. I mean, I'm not. But to their credit, they brought awareness of the Gaza humanitarian crisis recently, showing a very stark image of a starving child on their cover. And this particular edition, they had a piece on the plight of Ukrainian children. So I give them credit for that. But when it comes to domestic issues, it's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde thing with the Daily Express. I mean, they are glaringly, obviously in favour of the anti-migrant hotel protests. So it's ironic, they acknowledge the crisis in Gaza. They acknowledge that is a humanitarian crisis. No doubt there will be Palestinian refugees in coming over here, and it's almost like two different papers. Anyway, that's I'm going to be addressing the issue of the Ukrainian children. It's an extremely important issue, but for this one, Lucy Connolly. So initially, I thought she's incited violence. She's paying a price for it. Then I thought, well, she's got a custodial sentence, quite a hefty one, 3 years was the initial sentence. And she hasn't served anywhere near that time, just about a third of that. And I thought, okay, she should have been punished. Maybe it was a bit excessive. I honestly started thinking that. So that any right-wing reactionaries who want to immediately jump on this and say, I don't consider that. I did. I thought maybe it's a bit excessive. And I still think preventing her from seeing her child was a bit harsh. I don't think there was any real justification for that. But her attitude over the past few days, since her release, she was held in HMP Peterborough. She's been released after campaigns by right-wingers to get her released. Has been entirely self-centred. I don't think she's shown any humility. She hasn't shown any real remorse. And there are clear contradictions in her position. If she feels she was treated unfairly, why did she plead guilty? Now, people have pointed out that there's a contradiction between this and the case of the Labour councillor, Ricky Jones, who publicly called for far-right activists to have their throats cut. So you had an elected public official advocating violence. To be clear, I think his comments were a disgrace. Regardless of who they were aimed at, it was inflammatory, it was incitement to violence, and people are pointing out the double standards of the fact that he was cleared whereas Lucy Connolly was convicted. As I understand it, there's different legal procedures because Connolly pleaded guilty whereas Ricky Jones didn't. Now, I do think there's obvious double standards, so if someone incites violence, they should be held to account for it. I don't think that I can understand where those perceptions of double standards come about. But anyway, without further ado, I'm going to read out this piece in the Express. And as I read it, I'm going to counter some of it because there's simply a false narrative being spun by the right on this case. Okay, this report's by Tony Whitfield. Incidentally, I'm not saying that the right-wing press are lying about Lucy Connolly. They're just failing to include some important details. That's the point. Lucy Connolly is to meet the Trump administration today to talk about free speech. This is yesterday's paper. As she considers suing police after her comments about immigration were massively twisted and used against her. The childminder and mother of two also accused Sir Keir Starmer of holding her as a political prisoner after his divisive intervention in the unrest following the Southport murders. That's a very serious allegation. She's the wife of a Conservative councillor, so she's essentially accusing the Labour Prime Minister of taking political prisoners. Well, firstly, it's the judge that convicted her, not Keir Starmer. And secondly, that insinuates that Starmer is just going out of his way to have right wing politicians or their spouses locked up. It's a very serious allegation, and one which I think doesn't really add up. And there's a piece in this that explains why she believes that's the case, but I reject that. Miss Connolly, 42, was sentenced to 31 months for inciting racial hatred after she posted a tweet quickly deleted. This is a point that the right keep bringing up. Quickly deleted. No, it wasn't. It was held up for 3.5 hours. Now, the way the right are portraying this, it's almost as if, she done something reckless in a moment's stupidity and she immediately regretted it. 3.5 hours is hardly immediately regretting it. I think what happened is she cooled down a bit and then she reflected on it. She probably watched a TV show or something, but 3.5 hours I wouldn't call prompt. I understand she had 10,000 followers and the post was seen 310,000 times. That's like the equivalent of a medium-sized city. And bear in mind, this was in the midst of violent rioting in which lives were being threatened. That's the context in which this happened. So, I'm directly challenging this rubbish that it was immediately deleted. It wasn't. It was kept up for 3.5 hours. Immediately will be 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, not 3.5 hours later. So that's just a false narrative. If she immediately regretted her decision, she would have deleted it immediately, not 3.5 hours later. Then that's important because in that time, 310,000 people saw it, and some of them absolutely would have been influenced by it. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, it would be pretty illogical to think otherwise. And she said, let's see, where are we? After she posted a tweet quickly deleted, no, it wasn't quickly deleted, in which she wrongly suggests the Southport killer Axel Rudakabana was an illegal immigrant, and said she did not care if full asylum hotels were burnt down. What a disgusting thing to say. So she was advocating the buildings of people inside them be burnt to the ground. She was actually advocating mass murder. In her first interview since her release, she yesterday said that as a mother who had lost a young child herself, she had been upset and angry beyond belief, and that redness had clouded her judgment. However, she insisted she did not advocate violence. Well, that's a lie. That's exactly what she was doing. How the hell would you interpret advocating burning down a hotel with people inside it, if not advocating violence? So she's a complete hypocrite to say that she's not advocating violence when it's blatantly obvious that's what she was doing. It's not like she said, arrest these people or to hell with them or something like that. She advocated violence. And if she thinks that she wasn't doing that, why did she plead guilty? Why did she plead guilty? Is she suggesting she had a bad legal team or what? She pleaded guilty. So at the time she acknowledged that she'd done it. As for her personal trauma, yeah, that's an awful thing for someone to go through. But I have a big problem with people using personal trauma to not take responsibility for their own actions. The fact that she lost a young child herself, yes, it will make her sensitive to such issues. The whole country was disgusted by what happened to those 3 young girls. So I don't think Connolly can hide behind her own personal trauma to justify what she done and use it as an excuse. Because if that were the case, everyone who has suffered a personal trauma would have a green light to just do reckless and stupid things and then think that they can get away with it. So, yeah, she has had personal trauma in her life. And yes, as a mother, she reacted to that. I'm sure every mother in the country was disgusted and angry by what happened to those little girls. Incidentally, and this is something Connolly supporters won't mention, the father of one of those little girls has said he is not happy about the way Reform and other right-wing groups are exploiting that. So that's worth bearing in mind. However, she insisted she did not advocate violence. That's just a lie, because she has advocated violence. But in the wake of widespread unrest, Sir Keir condemned the far-right thuggery and warned anyone involved, whether directly or by whipping up this action online, would face the full force of the law. She told the Telegraph Sir Keir's speech last August was very divisive and claimed it had 100% affected how she was treated by the courts. Well, what fundamentally is wrong with what the Prime Minister said? He is saying what should be common sense, that anyone involved in violence or encouraging violence would face justice. If you believe in the rule of law, what would you have against that statement? And frankly, the Prime Minister was right to say that far-right thuggery was involved in that. My big problem with the political right is they've been utterly dishonest about this since it happened last year. They claim that they're against the violence, and those with some common sense would condemn the violence, but they've also tried to minimise it. And they've also tried to insist that there is no racist component. That is an absolute lie. It's an absolute lie. And I think they know it. In Middlesbrough, there were thugs literally stopping cars to see who the drivers were, to see what ethnic group they were. Also in Middlesbrough, violent mobs were going down the street known to house Asian people and targeting those buildings. That is a fact. So when the right have gone out of the way to insist that there was no far-right involvement or there was no racist component, it's utterly disingenuous. It's a lie. And I think it has to be confronted. So for Connolly to claim that it was the prosecutions were politically biased, does she seriously think that the violent thugs who were orchestrating that violence and involved in the violence were not motivated at all by racism? I mean, is she deluded? Or is she just a liar? I've heard the same argument about the violence in Ballymena. That, the violent mob targeting Filipinos were somehow not motivated by racism. Because they apparently can't tell the difference between a Filipino and a Romanian. Any foreigner will do. Starmer is a human rights lawyer, so maybe he needs to look at what people's human rights are, what freedom of speech means, and what the laws are in this country. Well, Lucy Connolly, freedom of speech does not mean inciting violence, and it never has meant that. Ms Connolly said Trump representatives are very interested in the way things are going in the UK, and they're obviously advocates for free speech. In other words, they want to interfere in the UK. She remains convinced she had been singled out because her husband was a Conservative councillor. And she said she would be holding police to account after they and the Crown Prosecution Service released a statement last September, later corrected, which claimed Miss Connolly had told officers she did not like immigrants and claimed that children were not safe from them. She said she was very well aware we need immigrants, but her concern was for illegal immigrants who pose a danger to national security and a danger to children. There's plenty of British nationals who pose a danger to children as well, but the right don't seem to care too much about that. Okay, on that last point, if her statement was taken out of context, then yes, the police should answer to that. Then it goes on to say Carol Malone has a piece, page 15, and Malone goes on about how much of a poor victim Lucy Connolly is, and in one tiny little microscopic fragment does Carol Malone admit that her tweet was vile. But it's almost like she's really, reluctant to even say it. Honestly, I'm sick of hearing about Lucy Connolly and how much a victim she is. This is a woman, an adult woman, entirely responsible for her own actions. She has no learning difficulties. She has no sort of situation that... And no, I'm sorry, I don't accept her traumatic background because, like I say, everyone who has that sort of issue, every woman who's ever suffered a miscarriage or another traumatic experience would then, according to Lucy Connolly's logic, have a green light to incite violence. I just don't accept that. Incidentally, in inciting that violence, yes, a lot of the migrants are male, but there's also women and children, so that would be directing violence against them as well. I just don't accept that argument. No, she did not delete it immediately. That is a lie. She took 3.5 hours to delete it. And she told friends initially that if arrested, she would use the mental health card. So that is not, to me, someone who has real remorse. And there's another glaring point. If she really felt that if the whole thing was overblown and she shouldn't have been held to account for her actions, why did she plead guilty? If she's now saying that she didn't incite violence, why did she plead guilty? I think she comes across as very arrogant and I think very insincere. I don't think she has any real remorse, because someone who has real remorse would frankly just move on rather than now trying to sue the police and sue everyone else in sight. instead of actually taking some responsibility. As for the custodial sentence, whether you think that's harsh or not, it's grotesque for Lucy Connolly to claim that part of free speech is the right to just say what you want. Free speech is not about inciting violence. You cannot just go out and cry fire in a crowded theatre. So honestly, I'm a little bit disgusted at the way the right are turning her into a poster girl for free speech. The implication being that free speech means you could just go and say whatever you want, even if it is incredibly reckless, even if it's putting lives in danger. And that is the reality. During those riots, lives were in danger. And it isn't just the migrants. The people working in those hotels and other facilities had their lives put at risk. There was a mosque, I can't recall off the top of my head the location, but the elderly imam was actually facing fumes coming from the outside. Had he gone outside, he probably would have been killed. That's the sort of situation that was going on. And I'm sick and tired of the right trying to downplay it and claim they were just fed up citizens. The Prime Minister was right to call it far right thuggery because absolutely the far right were involved. And if Connolly wants to run off to the Trump administration, if she thinks she's been so hard done by, she should really look at Trump's track record. Donald Trump's administration has aggressively tried to shut down any media outlets that have criticised it. They won't get away with that in America because the media is protected by the First Amendment. But I find it a bit grotesque that the Trump administration's being held up as crusaders of free speech. When you look at the sort of things that have gone on in America, I read a story yesterday about a guy who was responsible for a burger chain called Trump Burgers, and he has now been arrested by ICE. The irony of that. A Trump supporter arrested by ICE because he was an undocumented migrant. Freedom is under assault in the United States, the land of the free. If you look at some of the things ICE is doing, they are putting a 6-year-old child in the same bracket as MS-13 gang members. So, the right seem to hold up Donald Trump as some sort of crusader for free speech. This is a president who panders to brutal dictators like Putin. This is a president who I have no doubt would love to be a dictator himself. So anyway, Lucy Connolly, I had some sympathy. I thought it was a bit harsh to deny her access to her child, and I thought, okay, maybe this sentence is a bit harsh. But now, with her attitude in recent days, and with the way the right-wing press and her right-wing cheerleaders are distorting this, I've lost all sympathy. She isn't taking any real responsibility for what she said. I don't think she has any real remorse. It's pathetic that she's calling herself a political prisoner. She's putting herself in the same bracket as brave young Hong Kongers who stand up against an actual tyranny. It's pathetic. She should just take some responsibility and admit that she was indeed inciting violence. If she said, yes, I done that and it was a very big mistake, I shouldn't have done it, I would say, okay, we all make mistakes in life. But it's the fact that she's being disingenuous. She's claiming that she wasn't inciting violence. That's exactly what she was doing. Her supporters are claiming that the post was taken down immediately. That's a lie. It was 3.5 hours. 3.5 hours is not 2 minutes later, 5 minutes later. It's not even half an hour later. 3.5 hours. In that time, it was seen by 310,000 people. She did not immediately regret it. She joked with friends that she would use the mental health card. I think she only took it down, not out of any sense of guilt, or maybe I crossed the line here. I think it was purely selfish, that, I don't want to face legal consequences because I've incited violence. And as for her saying that her incarceration was politically driven, it's not the Prime Minister who determines justice. The judiciary is independent. So she could take it up with the judge if she thinks she was treated unfairly. I've often criticised the justice system, but I do not believe that we have a system whereby the government is determining political sentencing. I don't think there's any basis for that. Yes, there is an issue of two-tier justice. Yes, there is inconsistency. But I don't think there's sufficient evidence to show that people are being arrested simply for being right-wing in of itself, and that is being driven by the government. As for Ricky Jones being exonerated. I don't agree with that. I think he should have been held to account, but it was the jury that cleared him. You know, they would have heard all the evidence. I don't agree with it. I think, you know, for a public official to say what he said, um, you know, there is an argument that he should also have faced a custodial sentence. But whatever you think of the double standards in that, Lucy Connolly is not a victim, and I'm sick of her being treated like a victim. It would be you know, it's a disgrace how the right are distorting this. And I would suggest that when they, you know, when people like Carol Malone cry their crocodile tears, by which I mean they pretend that they don't agree with what she said, I'm going to say right now, I think they actually do agree with what she said. I mean, if you look at the way the right wing press cover migrants, they're attacking them on a daily basis. They're vilifying them on a daily basis. There's a very orchestrated um, campaign of stigmatization against migrants in general, not just those who have committed serious crimes, just general. So I honestly think that there is a large component of the right basically agree with what Lucy Connolly wrote, but they're smart enough not to say that. You know, say, "Oh, it was awful what she wrote. We don't really agree with that." But I think a lot of them, at the back of their mind, they're thinking, "Yeah, maybe the migrants deserve that. You know, it's an invasion; they deserve it." Um, and it's a very dangerous thing that we're seeing, this dehumanization. So you know, Lucy Connolly can cry a river. She incited violence. She paid a price for it. She's not a victim.